Picture this. It's 1945. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, is finally over. You'd think the world would get a moment of peace, right? Well, not exactly. As the smoke clears, a new, different kind of conflict is already starting to simmer. Two superpowers who were once allies are now staring each other down, kicking off a tense, 45-year standoff that would change the world forever. See, as the old empires of the world were crumbling, two new giants stepped onto the stage, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their partnership to defeat fascism, that pretty much evaporated overnight. Suddenly, they were on opposite sides of a new global chessboard, and each had a completely different idea for how the future should look. And believe me, they were willing to do just about anything to make their vision a reality. So what was this all about? Well, at its core, it was a clash of two totally incompatible ideas. On one side, you have the USA, pushing for capitalism and democracy. Free markets, the right to vote for different parties, all that stuff. And on the other side, you've got the USSR, which is all about communism and authoritarian rule. The government owns everything, and there's only one party in charge. For both of them, the other's very existence was a threat. It was a zero-sum game. Okay, so this wasn't just some philosophical debate. This massive ideological gap literally ripped the continent of Europe in two, creating a very real, very physical division that would define the next several decades.
As the Soviet Red Army pushed back the Nazis, they didn't just go home. They stayed. And Stalin set up loyal communist puppet governments all across Eastern Europe. And Winston Churchill just nailed it with this famous quote. He said an iron curtain had come down, separating East from West. It was the perfect description of this new, divided reality.
The first real test, the first major flashpoint, happened in Berlin. In 1948, Stalin decided to blockade West Berlin, cutting off all food and supplies. He was basically trying to starve the city into joining the communist side. But the US and its allies responded with something incredible, a massive airlift. For almost a year, they flew in everything the city needed. This was a huge deal. It was the first big showdown, and it really cemented America's main Cold War strategy: containment. Basically, stop communism from spreading no matter what. But as dangerous as all that was, things were about to get, terrifyingly worse. The competition was about to shift from tanks and planes to weapons that could literally end human civilization as we know it. By 1949, the Soviets had the bomb. The nuclear arms race was on. And this is where we get this absolutely insane idea called mutually assured destruction. Yeah, M.A.D. The acronym kind of says it all, right? The logic was completely bonkers, but also kind of simple. The only thing stopping an all-out nuclear war was the fact that nobody, and I mean nobody, could possibly win one. Think about it. It's a terrifyingly simple four-step dance to oblivion. Side A launches its missiles. Side B sees them coming. Before Side A's missiles can even land, Side B launches everything they have in return. And the result? Complete and total global annihilation. It's grim, but that grim math is probably what kept the Cold War from turning into World War III. But hey, it wasn't all just about blowing up the planet. Nope. It was also a battle to prove who was better, whose system was superior. And the ultimate stage for that? Space. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, it sent shockwaves through America. And just like that, the space race was on. It was the ultimate propaganda battle, and it all built up to that iconic moment of the US landing on the moon. Now, this is a super important point. We call it the Cold War, right? But for millions of people around the world, it was anything but cold. In fact, for them, it was incredibly hot, bloody, and devastating. So to avoid that direct nuclear M.A.D scenario, the US and the USSR found another way to fight. They used proxy wars. It was like a global chess game where the two main players never touched each other directly. Instead, they would pick opposite sides in civil wars across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, pouring in money and weapons to fuel the fire. And the results? Just devastating. The Korean War ended in a bitter stalemate that still divides the peninsula today. The Vietnam War became a long, brutal nightmare for the United States that ended in a humiliating withdrawal. And then the Soviets got their own Vietnam and Afghanistan, a bloody decade-long war that helped speed up the collapse of their entire empire. But out of all these flashpoints and proxy wars, there was one moment, 13 days, in October 1962, where the world literally held its breath, staring right into the abyss of nuclear war. 90 miles. Just think about that. That's it.
That's the distance that separated the coast of Florida from Soviet nuclear missiles that had been secretly installed on the island of Cuba. These weren't small missiles either. They could hit Washington, D.C. in just a matter of minutes.
So what do you do if you're President Kennedy? You've got this impossible choice. You could invade Cuba, but that would almost certainly start World War III. Or you could do nothing and just live with a nuclear gun pointed at your head. He tried to find a third way, a naval blockade, which they carefully called a quarantine, around Cuba. And man, for those 13 agonizing days, it felt like the end of the world was just around the corner. Soviet ships were steaming right for the American blockade line. People were genuinely preparing for the worst. But at the very last second, a secret back-channel deal was made. The Soviets agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba, and in return, the U.S. quietly promised to remove its missiles from Turkey later on. The whole world breathed a collective sigh of relief. And you want to know something crazy? We came even closer to disaster than most people realize. During the blockade, a Soviet submarine was cornered by U.S. forces. The captain, thinking war had already broken out, ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. The launch required the agreement of 3 senior officers. 2 of them said yes, but one man, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. His single refusal very likely saved the world from nuclear war. Okay, so the world pulls back from the brink. But the Cold War is far from over. It grinds on for another 2 decades. But as we get into the 1980s, you start to see these deep cracks forming inside the Soviet Union itself. And a big part of the story comes down to money. Just look at this. You had President Ronald Reagan in the US ramping up military spending like crazy, basically daring the Soviets to keep pace. The problem was, the Soviet state-run economy was already struggling badly. Trying to keep up with the U.S. in the arms race, on top of their disastrous war in Afghanistan, was literally bankrupting the country. And then a new leader comes onto the scene in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He could see the writing on the wall. He knew the system was failing. So he took a huge gamble. He introduced 2 revolutionary new policies: glasnost, which meant openness and more free speech, and perestroika, which meant restructuring the economy. His goal was to save the Soviet Union. But what he actually did was open Pandora's box. It was like opening a floodgate. You give people a little bit of freedom, and suddenly they want all of it. The calls for change just swept across Eastern Europe, and it all came to a head on one incredible night, November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall, the most powerful and hated symbol of the Cold War, was torn down. And it wasn't torn down by an army, but by ordinary people with hammers and chisels. The Iron Curtain was gone. After that, the end came incredibly fast. One by one, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed. And then, on Christmas Day of 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union itself was officially dissolved. Just like that, it was over. After 45 years of tension and living on the brink of Armageddon, the Cold War ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. So yeah, the Cold War is officially over. But is it really? Look around. The world we live in today was forged in that fire. Alliances like NATO, conflicts that are still raging, the nuclear weapons that are still out there, it all has roots in this 45-year standoff. It was a time that pushed us to the very edge of extinction, but also, weirdly enough, pushed us to reach for the stars. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Have we really learned the lessons of the past? And are we ready for a future where new great power rivalries are starting to look eerily familiar?
Please like and subscribe.